I recently spoke with a man named Omar during a trip through a deeply devout region of South Asia. He was clutching prayer beads so tightly his knuckles were white, sitting in a clinic waiting room where the electricity flickered every 10 minutes. He told me, with a look of absolute, terrifying certainty, that his daughter's recovery was entirely in God's hands. To him, the lack of modern antibiotics or the crumbling infrastructure wasn't the primary concern. It was a matter of spiritual endurance. "The more we suffer here," he said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "the greater our reward will be there." He seemed almost nourished by the hardship. But then a news report flashed on the grainy TV in the corner. A local politician was giving a fiery speech, framed by religious icons, shouting about protecting their sacred values from secular corruption. Omar's face transformed instantly. The quiet desperation vanished, replaced by a sharp, jagged anger. He began nodding vigorously, cursing people he had never met in countries he would never visit, convinced they were the reason his life was a struggle. In that moment, his faith didn't look like a comfort, it looked like a blindfold. It was a jarring sight. Here was a man using the very thing that gave him hope to justify the systems that were failing his own family. It made me wonder about a contradiction we usually ignore. We've been told for centuries that religion is the essential foundation for a moral, prosperous, and stable society. Yet as we look at the world in 2026, the data suggests something far more uncomfortable. The countries that pray the loudest are often the ones struggling to survive, while the nations that have largely walked away from the pews are the ones actually thriving. If religion is the key to a better life, why does the map show us the exact opposite?
Yeah, I mean, the contradiction you're pointing out there is, well, it's arguably the most documented sociological reality of our time. But it's also, the most fiercely denied.
Right. It makes people incredibly uncomfortable.
Extremely. Because we're constantly fed this baseline assumption, like right from birth, that morality and societal cohesion are just inextricably linked to a fear of a divine creator.
Like if nobody's watching from above, we'll all just turn on each other.
Exactly. The logic seems intuitive if you're raised in those systems. Without an ultimate judge, society should technically fracture into selfish chaos. But when sociologists actually map out human development, things like violent crime, corruption, overall well-being, the inverse is glaringly apparent.
The map totally flips.
It completely flips. The societies functioning at the absolute zenith of human prosperity and peace are those where the concept of a deity has been, almost completely expunged from the public square. Yeah, so to really understand the mechanics of this, we can't just look at the struggling nations. We have to rigorously examine the environments where secularism isn't just an academic theory, but like the ambient temperature of everyday life. We have to look at how a society structures its morality when nobody's looking down from the clouds.
I love that phrase, the ambient temperature of everyday life. I want to take the listener right into the heart of that, to really strip away the abstractions and look at the physical reality of it. To really understand what it means for a society to function without that divine surveillance, you have to walk the streets of a place like Aarhus, Denmark.
Oh, Aarhus is a perfect example.
Right. So imagine it's a Tuesday morning. The sky is that perpetual, bruised Scandinavian gray, and there's this steady, cold rain just slicking the cobblestones. You're observing a man named Søren.
Okay, set in the scene.
Yeah, Søren is a mid-level municipal clerk. He's the kind of guy whose life is defined by very quiet, predictable routines. For him, the most acute crisis he will face this month, like the absolute peak of his existential dread, is whether the new light rail extension will be delayed by a few minutes, causing him to be late for a departmental meeting.
Which is, an incredibly mundane threshold for crisis.
It is entirely mundane, and that is exactly the point. In this environment, the cosmic stakes are just gone. Søren doesn't wake up in a cold sweat, dropping to his knees to pray that a sudden illness won't bankrupt his family.
Right, because he has universal health care.
Exactly. He doesn't petition a higher power to keep his daughter safe on her walk to the local public school. Instead of prayer, he relies on this sprawling, largely invisible infrastructure of social trust.
He trusts the system.
Yeah, he pays an income tax rate that would make most Americans hyperventilate. But in exchange, he simply watches the system work. To give you a concrete example of how this plays out in moments of friction, I learned about a time Søren's bicycle was stolen.
A stolen bike in Denmark.
Right, which in Aarhus is about as severe as street crime gets. So when he discovered the cut lock, his reaction was just incredibly telling. He didn't view the theft as some symptom of moral decay in his community.
He didn't see it as a spiritual failing?
No. He didn't frame it as a spiritual test of his patience, and he certainly didn't, appeal to God for justice against the thief. He simply pulled out his phone, logged into a centralized, highly encrypted digital portal linked to his citizen ID number, tapped a few buttons to file a standard insurance claim,
And got his money back.
literally had the full reimbursement deposited directly into his bank account within 48 hours.
And that rapid bureaucratic resolution essentially short-circuits the need for a theological coping mechanism.
But the psychological byproduct of that is what really fascinates me. When the state removes all the sharp edges from life, the vulnerability that CERN experiences isn't the terror of destitution or violence. He actually expressed that he suffers from a strange, pervasive sense of existential boredom. He occasionally feels, in his own words, too safe.
Ow. Too safe.
Think about what a staggering historical luxury that is. I mean, for 99% of human history, sheer survival was a daily coin toss. To reach a societal baseline where your biggest emotional burden is feeling too insulated from risk, that is a psychological state that requires an extraordinarily high-trust, heavily secular foundation. But I struggle with how this operates at scale, The critics of secularism always argue that without a shared religious narrative, a society loses its moral anchor and descends into nihilism. So how do the Danes maintain this profound social harmony without a unified spiritual text telling them to be good to each other?
Well, to understand that, we really need to look at the ground-level mechanics of their belief systems, rather than just projecting our own anxieties onto them. Sociologist Phil Zuckerman actually spent 14 months deeply immersed in Denmark and Sweden just to figure this out.
14 months just studying how they process morality without religion.
Exactly. Conducting exhaustive qualitative interviews to figure out exactly how morality functions in the absence of piety. His methodology involved sitting in their living rooms, attending their community board meetings, and essentially interrogating their lack of faith.
Because I feel like the assumption is that secular people are just really aggressive atheists.
Right, but what he uncovered thoroughly dismantles the assumption that a secular society is a nihilistic one, or even an aggressive one. In Scandinavia, the absence of God isn't a void. It's replaced by an intense, almost clinical commitment to civic responsibility. Yeah, these are objectively among the most empathetic, calmest, and least corrupt societies on the planet. But what's crucial is how they actually process the concept of religion when pressed on it. Zuckerman categorized modern secularism there into 3 distinct psychological profiles. And honestly, none of them resemble the militant atheism you see debated in the media.
Okay, I would assume that in a highly educated, secular society, there'd be like a strong, active pushback against religion. You're saying they aren't actively hostile to the concept of faith.
Hostility requires a level of emotional investment that simply isn't present there. The first category Zuckerman identified is a profound reluctance or reticence.
Reticence to even talk about it.
Exactly. Even among the minority who harbor some vague, undefinable belief in a higher power, discussing it is viewed as a massive social faux pas. It's considered intensely private, on par with discussing the intimate details of your finances or your medical history.
Wow, so if a politician brought it up?
If you injected theological language into a public debate or a political platform, it would be met with intense embarrassment for the speaker. People would just cringe.
It's treated as a breach of social etiquette rather than a profound philosophical stance.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. The second, and far more prevalent category, is what he calls benign indifference. To this demographic, religion is viewed through the exact same lens we might use to view ancient Greek mythology.
Like, interesting stories, but not real life.
They acknowledge the historical value of the parables. They might even appreciate the moral architecture of a story about loving your neighbor. But the idea that these ancient texts should dictate modern tax policy, reproductive rights, or educational curricula, they view that as totally absurd.
Right. They just take the good parts and ignore the rest.
They extract whatever mild ethical utility they can from the stories and discard the supernatural demands completely.
Okay, I can wrap my head around indifference, but it still implies that they have, evaluated the claims of religion and chosen to walk away.
Which brings us to the third category, and this is the one that truly shocks observers, coming from deeply devout backgrounds like South Asia or parts of the United States. Sociologists term this utter obliviousness.
Obliviousness, like they just don't know about it.
We are talking about millions of highly educated, functional citizens who have simply never, at any point in their lives, deeply pondered the existence of God. The question of divine creation or an afterlife simply does not register on their cognitive radar.
That is wild to me.
It isn't a rejection of faith. It's a total non-encounter with the concept. When Zuckerman asked these individuals what they thought happened after death, the most common response was a shrug and a literal statement of, I haven't really thought about it.
They just don't care.
The existential real estate that religion occupies in the minds of people like Omar, who you met in South Asia, simply does not exist for them.
Wait, I need to push back on this framework a bit because there is a massive structural contradiction here. If they are so profoundly indifferent or utterly oblivious to God, why do the Danes still have a state-supported national church?
Christian.
You are telling me these people don't think about the afterlife, yet a vast majority of them voluntarily pay a specific church tax out of their income to maintain the evangelical Lutheran church. They still baptize their children, they still get married in these massive ornate stone cathedrals. I mean, that doesn't look like obliviousness to me. That looks like a society hedging its bets.
I get why it looks that way, but it looks like a contradiction only if you assume that participating in a religious ritual requires theological belief. What you're describing is the phenomenon of cultural religion, and understanding the mechanics behind it is vital.
Cultural religion, so it's not about faith at all.
When a Danish citizen pays that voluntary church tax, they are not purchasing a ticket to heaven, nor are they supporting the dissemination of Lutheran dogma. They are funding the architectural maintenance of their national history.
So the cathedral isn't a house of God. It's practically a state-funded museum of Danish identity.
Essentially, yes. It is an institution of cultural continuity. When they utilize the church for a wedding or a funeral, they're doing so because the aesthetic and the tradition connect them to generations of their ancestors.
All right, it feels appropriately grand for a big life event.
Exactly.
Okay.
It provides a solemn, beautiful framework for the major milestones of human life, birth, pairing, and death. They want the organ music, they want the historic setting, and they want the feeling of communal belonging. But they utterly decouple those rituals from the theological demands of the religion.
They want the community without the theology.
Exactly. The church has been hollowed out of its supernatural content and repurposed as a civic utility.
You know, that reframes the entire dynamic for me. If I look at Søren's life, the way he interacts with the digital portal for his stolen bike, the way he relies on the healthcare system, the way he uses the church merely as an aesthetic backdrop for his wedding, I am struck by a realization. It is as if the Scandinavian welfare state has meticulously reverse-engineered the promises of ancient religion and actually manifested them in physical reality. For millennia, scriptures promise that if you suffered in this life like Omar in that clinic, an invisible, omnipotent force would eventually balance the scales, provide you with ultimate security, and heal your wounds in a distant afterlife. But in Aarhus, the state is the invisible, omnipotent force.
And it isn't waiting for the afterlife.
Exactly. It is delivering providence right now. The government is doing the heavy lifting of divine intervention. It guarantees your health care, it ensures your housing, it equalizes the wealth, it provides the heaven on earth so effectively that the ancient promise of a supernatural heaven becomes economically obsolete.
Your observation regarding the obsolescence of the supernatural promise that bridges us directly into the macroeconomic data. Because we're not just talking about cultural quirks in a few Nordic countries. We're looking at a predictable mathematical relationship between human security and religious adherence.
So this isn't just a Scandinavian thing.
Economists have constructed massive longitudinal data sets to test this exact dynamic. For instance, the empirical research compiled by economists like Robert Barrow and Rachel McCleary. They utilize panel data spanning 61 countries over several decades.
Panel data, meaning they track the exact same places over a long time.
Right. Panel data allows econometricians to track the same variables across multiple time periods, controlling for unique national characteristics, to see how changes in one factor influence another. Their analysis rigorously tested the secularization hypothesis.
Okay, I want to make sure you and the listener are on the exact same page regarding what that hypothesis actually claims. Because the classic secularization hypothesis basically states that as a society modernizes and its gross domestic product goes up, its religious fervor automatically goes down. The richer you get, the less you pray.
That is the blunt summary, yes. But the econometric data forces us to be much more precise about the mechanisms. It isn't just about having more money in the bank.
It's more complicated than just GDP.
More. The data shows that extreme religiosity in struggling low-income nations is frequently misdiagnosed by outsiders as a sign of profound spiritual depth or moral superiority. However, When we analyze the variables, we see that high rates of prayer and strict religious adherence in these environments are largely symptoms of material desperation and high variance risk.
Risk being the key word there.
Absolutely. When you lack a reliable pension, when a single failed harvest means starvation, and when a minor infection can be lethal because there is no public health infrastructure, your existence is characterized by chronic, terrifying uncertainty.
And when you have zero worldly control over your own survival, you have no choice but to petition a higher power. You are outsourcing your anxiety to God because the local government is too corrupt or incompetent to help you.
Yes. The urgency of prayer is directly proportional to the precariousness of daily life. The Barrow and McCleary data demonstrate that as a society builds out what sociologists call existential security, meaning universal health care, reliable safety nets, and predictable food supplies, the functional necessity of religious reliance plummets.
You don't need a miracle if you have a grocery store.
Exactly. You simply do not need to beg a deity for your daily bread when agricultural subsidies and modern supply chains have structurally guaranteed that the grocery store shelves will be full.
We have to address a massive historical misconception here, because for centuries, the brightest minds in philosophy, people like Sigmund Freud, David Hume, Karl Marx, they all looked at religion and essentially diagnosed it as a symptom of intellectual immaturity.
Yes, the old religion is just ignorance argument.
Right. Their theory was that human beings invented God because they didn't understand physics or biology. Therefore, the assumption was always that as soon as we build universities and teach the population about evolution and the scientific method, religion will just evaporate. They thought education was the ultimate cure for faith.
It is a highly arrogant assumption, and more importantly, the economic data completely shatters it. If we look closely at the variables driving secularization, we must definitively debunk the education myth.
Well, education doesn't kill religion.
Higher educational attainment in isolation does not inherently decrease religious participation. In fact, if we isolate the data in several developed nations, we find a totally counterintuitive trend. Individuals with advanced degrees often exhibit higher rates of church attendance than those with less education.
I mean, why would a data scientist with a PhD be sitting in a pew on Sunday morning more often than someone who never finished high school? If religion is just a way to explain the unexplainable, the scientist should be the first one out the door.
Because religion is rarely just an epistemological tool for explaining the universe. It is a primary engine for generating social capital.
Social capital, like networking.
Exactly. Educated professionals often seek out highly structured networking environments, robust community ties, and organized group activities for their families. In many societies, the church remains the most efficient, pre-existing infrastructure for building those social networks. The data scientist isn't necessarily attending the service because they suddenly believe the earth was created in 6 literal days. They are attending because the church provides a high-trust community where they can build relationships, find reputable babysitters, and engage in civic organizing.
It's practically a country club for civic engagement.
Right. The church acts as a sociological glue, and educated populations are highly adept at utilizing institutions for social benefit. So education alone is not the mechanism that destroys religious adherence.
If education isn't the silver bullet for secularization, and we know it's tied to existential security, how does the physical layout of our societies play into this? Because you can't talk about modernization without talking about the shift from farms to cities.
Urbanization is arguably the most powerful catalyst for the secular shift. We really have to analyze the profound psychological difference between an agrarian environment and an urban one.
It's a completely different way of living.
Totally different. In a rural agricultural society, the economic output of the entire community is entirely at the mercy of unpredictable, immense natural forces. A drought, a sudden flood, or a swarm of locusts can annihilate a year's worth of labor in a single afternoon.
And there's nothing you can do about it.
Nothing. In an environment where humans have virtually zero control over the variables of their own economic survival, religion serves an indispensable psychological function. It provides a cognitive framework to process arbitrary disasters. It allows a farmer to believe that the drought has a purpose, or that a ritual might actually summon the rain.
Right, because you can't negotiate with the weather system. But if you convince yourself the weather system is controlled by a conscious entity, you can offer sacrifices, you can pray, you can repent. It gives you an illusion of agency where none actually exists.
Exactly, the illusion of agency. However, when a population migrates to dense urban centers, the environment changes drastically. A city is a highly engineered, deeply predictable, human-constructed ecosystem.
You're not worrying about a drought ruining your spreadsheet.
Right. You are no longer interacting with the terrifying capriciousness of nature. You are interacting with plumbing, electricity grids, and public transit. Furthermore, urbanization shatters the monopoly that the rural church held over community life.
So,
Well, in a village, the church is the only place to gather. In a city, you have access to labor unions, political clubs, theaters, cafes, and diverse interest groups. The religious institution suddenly finds itself competing in a crowded marketplace of social organizations.
I love that you use the term marketplace because this entire sociological shift was essentially predicted by an economist hundreds of years before we had the data to prove it. Adam Smith, the guy who essentially wrote the operating manual for modern capitalism with The Wealth of Nations back in 1776, he actually dedicated a significant portion of his analysis to the economics of religious institutions.
He did, and it's brilliant.
He didn't look at churches as mystical entities. He looked at them as firms competing for market share.
Smith's analysis in Book V of The Wealth of Nations is astonishingly prescient. He applied the exact same microeconomic principles he used to analyze trade to the behavior of the clergy.
Amazing.
He focused heavily on the structural incentives created by state sponsorship. Smith observed what happens when a government heavily subsidizes a specific religion, like the Church of England or the Catholic Church in pre-revolutionary France, guaranteeing the clergy a fixed income through taxation, regardless of how many people actually attend the services.
And he coined a brilliant term for this. He called the state-sponsored church a lazy monopoly. Think about what happens when you have only one internet provider in your town.
Everyone hates their monopolistic ISP.
Exactly. They don't have to upgrade their cables, they don't have to provide good customer service, and they can treat you terribly because they know you have nowhere else to go. The revenue is guaranteed. Smith realized that when a government guarantees the church's revenue, the clergy become the religious equivalent of a terrible internet provider.
That is a highly functional analogy. Smith argued that when the clergy's financial survival is disconnected from the quality of their spiritual service, they inevitably become indolent. They become bureaucrats.
They just punch the clock.
Yes. They lose the motivation to deliver compelling sermons, they stop visiting the sick, and they lose touch with the granular daily suffering of their congregants. The religious institution becomes a stagnant, elitist administration. It survives only because the state forces a population to fund it.
But Smith contrasted that lazy monopoly with environments where the state stayed out of religion entirely, forcing different sects to compete. He called them the upstart sects.
Yes. He posited that a free market of religion pluralism forces vibrancy. When you have multiple independent religious groups operating in the same city, and they rely entirely on the voluntary donations of their members to keep the lights on, the economic incentives shift radically.
They have to hustle.
The clergy must work tirelessly to attract and retain their congregants. They have to innovate. They have to provide genuine emotional support, compelling theology, and tangible community services. The pressure of competition ensures that the religious institutions remain highly responsive to the actual needs of the people.
So we have this massive, centuries-long shift driven by urbanization, existential security, and market forces. But I want to pause here and challenge the policy implications of this data.
Okay.
Because if a leader looks at this research and concludes, okay, secularization is the hallmark of a prosperous, high-trust society. Therefore, to modernize my country immediately, I just need to outlaw religion. I will close the churches, ban the texts, and force everyone to rely on the state. That seems like a logical shortcut.
It is a shortcut that has historically led to some of the most catastrophic human rights disasters of the modern era. The data firmly dictates that the decline of religious adherence must be an organic consequence of prosperity, never a prerequisite violently enforced by the state.
Right, it has to happen naturally.
When authoritarian regimes in the 20th century, whether it was the Soviet Union's militant state atheism, Maoist China's Cultural Revolution, or the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, when they attempted to forcibly eradicate religion to accelerate modernization, they fundamentally misunderstood human psychology.
You cannot strip away the psychological software of faith without first building the material hardware of a functioning society.
Precisely.
If you violently tear away the only coping mechanism a struggling population has, their belief in divine justice, before you have actually built the hospitals, the pension systems, and the transparent courts to replace that need, you do not get a rational, enlightened populace. You just get raw, unmitigated terror. Secularization only stabilizes into that peaceful Aarhus-style harmony when it is the natural, unforced byproduct of a society where people simply stop feeling the need to pray because their lives are secure.
Attempting to manipulate the religious impulses of a population from the top down is inherently volatile. And while violently suppressing religion is disastrous, the inverse aggressively weaponizing religion to maintain state power is equally destructive and far more prevalent in the geopolitics of 2026.
The weaponization of the divine. This is where the macroeconomic data bleeds into terrifying political reality. I want the listener to picture a specific scene that encapsulates how this machinery operates. Whenever I read these sociological studies about elite manipulation, I think of a man I met. For the sake of the narrative, let's call him the architect.
The architect.
Okay. Imagine a capital city where the skyline is dominated by towering minarets, interspersed with heavy military checkpoints. The heat outside is suffocating, baking the dust into the air, but inside the architect's office, the air conditioning is humming at a freezing temperature.
Total insulation from the street level.
Exactly. He is sitting behind a massive desk, sipping an imported espresso, and I'm watching his hands. They are physically trembling as he tries to light a cigarette.
A physical manifestation of profound anxiety.
Absolute terror. But he isn't terrified of God. He is terrified of the monitors on his wall. The screens are broadcasting live footage of thousands of people flooding the streets outside his ministry, screaming themselves hoarse, chanting aggressive, rhythmic slogans. And here is the dark twist. The architect wrote those slogans.
He manufactured the outrage.
He is a high-level strategist for a populist leader, and his entire job is to manufacture holy wars. His government wanted to execute a highly corrupt, economically devastating land seizure from a minority group. If they had simply announced the policy, the citizens would have rioted against the government.
Because it was blatant theft.
Right. So the architect drafted speeches that meticulously injected the language of divine will and sacred duty into the policy. He took a secular administrative theft and dressed it up in the armor of religious necessity. He watched the crowds chanting his manufactured dogma, realizing that he had successfully outsourced the government's political violence to the religious fervor of the citizens.
Fine.
And he knew that once you uncork that level of righteous fury, you can never fully control where it points next. Religion, in his hands, was not a system of spiritual enlightenment. It was the ultimate weaponized tool for population management.
The mechanism you're describing in that office, it's the foundational tactic of political exploitation. And it's crucial to recognize that this is a structural phenomenon, not a theological one. It spans the entire globe, operating across completely divergent belief systems.
It's a playbook, basically.
Exactly. We see the precise mechanics of the architect's strategy deployed in the United States under the banner of Christian nationalism. Political actors explicitly frame secular policy disputes, such as tax reform or environmental regulations, as cosmic battles between good and evil, invoking divine intervention to legitimize their candidacies and branding their political opponents as literal agents of demonic forces.
It fundamentally breaks the democratic process. You can compromise on a tax rate. You cannot compromise with a demon.
That is the functional utility of the strategy. It eliminates the possibility of debate. We observe the exact same structural weaponization in India, with the rise of Hindu nationalism, where state leaders present their administrative agendas as the fulfillment of a divine national destiny, inextricably blurring the lines between citizenship and religious adherence.
It's everywhere.
We see it in the mechanics of Sikh politics, where political factions like the Akali Dal have historically utilized the authority of seminary chiefs to issue religious edicts, effectively mandating that the masses vote for specific candidates as a matter of spiritual duty.
So, mechanically, how does this work on the human brain? Why is it so incredibly easy for corrupt elites to hijack a population's faith and redirect it? What is the specific vulnerability they are exploiting?
The vulnerability lies in the fact that religion, by its very nature, excels at constructing two powerful psychological anchors: a common, unifying God and a common existential enemy. For ruling elites overseeing failing systems, this is an invaluable asset.
A built-in scapegoat mechanism.
Let's look at the economic reality. If the public infrastructure is crumbling, if inflation is destroying purchasing power, and if the political class is flagrantly hiding wealth in offshore accounts, the natural, rational response of the population should be to direct their anger upwards at the government. They should demand accountability.
Right, pitchforks at the palace.
However, if the political elite can successfully engineer a religious crisis, if they can convince the public that their sacred values are under imminent threat from secular corruptors, marginalized minorities, or foreign non-believers, they perform a masterful sleight of hand.
Look over here, not over there.
They redirect the vast reservoir of legitimate economic frustration away from their own corruption and channel it horizontally against a manufactured scapegoat. The population becomes so obsessed with defending the purity of their faith that they forget to demand clean drinking water.
That perfectly explains the broad macro-level manipulation by the state. But the data also forces us to look at the extreme micro-level. It forces us to examine groups that operate completely outside the state, using religion not just to distract, but to forge terrifyingly potent militias. We are talking about the mechanics of violent extremism.
This is where we must apply rigorous economic analysis to behavior that appears entirely irrational to the outside world. Economists, drawing heavily on the work of Lawrence Sienna Cohn, have developed what is known as the club model of extreme religion.
The club model.
Yes. This framework uses rational choice theory and behavioral economics to analyze the internal dynamics of highly strict, exclusionary, and often violent sex groups like Hamas, the Taliban, or extreme ultra-Orthodox paramilitaries.
I have to admit, applying rational microeconomic models to a terrorist group or a radical fundamentalist militia feels highly counterintuitive. When you see a group demanding that its members commit acts of violence, or forcing them to wear bizarre, stigmatizing clothing, or mandating extreme dietary restrictions, the immediate assumption is that these people have simply been brainwashed.
People assume they're just crazy.
Right. They are acting irrationally because they're in a cult. How does an economist look at that and say, no, this is actually a highly rational, calculated structure?
By analyzing the group as an economic firm that produces a club good. A club good is a product or service whose quality depends heavily on the active participation and enthusiasm of its members. Think of a choir or a neighborhood watch. If half the members don't show up or don't put in effort, the quality of the group plummets for everyone.
Yeah, the choir sounds terrible.
Exactly. The greatest threat to any club is the free rider, the individual who wants to enjoy the benefits of the community, the social support, and the shared resources without actually contributing any effort or sacrifice.
The person who eats all the food at the potluck but never brings a dish.
Precisely the concept, but applied to extreme religious survival. In a moderate mainstream religion, the cost of entry is low. You show up on Sunday, you sit in the back, you might drop $1 in the basket, and you get to enjoy the music and the sense of community.
It's easy.
The group is full of free riders, which makes it socially pleasant, but relatively weak in terms of mobilizing collective action. But a radical sect cannot afford free riders. They need absolute, unwavering commitment to execute high-risk operations. So how does the group organically filter out the casual participants? They impose draconian costs of entry.
They demand sacrifices that only a true fanatic would be willing to pay.
They enforce extreme strictness. By mandating behaviors that carry massive social stigma, such as refusing to interact with outsiders, wearing highly conspicuous and alienating clothing, or committing acts of violence that make them wanted by the state, the group strategically destroys the members' outside options.
Let me try an analogy to translate the economic jargon into something visceral. Imagine you are invited to join an incredibly exclusive, powerful, private club. The benefits of being inside are massive. Absolute financial support, instant brotherhood, a profound sense of purpose.
A very tempting offer.
But the entry fee isn't money. The entry fee is that you have to publicly burn down your own house, cut off all contact with your parents, and tattoo the club's logo on your face.
A dramatic but structurally accurate representation.
If that is the cost of entry, the casual opportunists, the free riders, are going to take one look at those demands and run the other way. The only people who will actually pay that price and join the club are those who are fiercely, intensely committed to the core ideology. But more importantly, once you pay that price, once you have the tattoo on your face and you've burned your bridges, you can never go back to normal society.
You've completely alienated yourself.
You are a pariah. Your outside options are gone. You can't just quit the club and get a job at a bank. You are entirely existentially dependent on the club for your survival. This artificial isolation guarantees maximum loyalty. It takes a group of people and forges them into an unbreakable, highly potent weapon.
That is the chilling brilliance of the club model. It utilizes stigma and sacrifice not merely as theological tests, but as rational mechanisms to screen out apathy and enforce complete dependency. And while we see this extreme weaponization in isolated pockets, there is a much broader, quieter tragedy occurring across entire regions where dogma dictates daily life. It is what economists would term the massive opportunity cost of pervasive religious adherence.
The opportunity cost. We constantly measure what religion allegedly gives a society, but we almost never measure what it actively extracts from it. We never measure the intellectual capital that is incinerated on the altar of dogma.
It's a staggering loss.
To ground this concept, I want you, the listener, to picture a girl named Miriam. I met her in a rural village where the infrastructure was so neglected that the only building with a reliable, uninterrupted flow of electricity was the central house of worship. Every other structure, including the medical clinic and the school, was subject to crippling, rolling blackouts.
A common reality in many developing regions.
I spent an afternoon watching her in the courtyard of her family's compound. She was kneeling in the dirt, holding a small stick, intensely focused. She was dropping stones from a wall, timing them, and then scratching out a kinematic equation in the dust. S equals ut plus 1/2 it squared.
She was empirically calculating the trajectory of gravity.
Yes. She had an aggressively brilliant, hungry, scientific mind. But Miriam's cognitive potential was being actively starved by the structural demands of her society. Because she lived in a hyper-devout community, the local authorities mandated that she spend 6 hours a day, every single day, memorizing and reciting 14th century theological commentaries detailing the hierarchies of invisible celestial spirits.
6 hours a day, just rote memorization.
She was forced to memorize answers to questions about a world that doesn't exist, while the real world around her was crumbling. When her handlers weren't looking, she pulled out a book she had hidden underneath her prayer mat. It was a physics textbook. The pages were warped from water damage. The cover was torn off, but she handled it like it was made of gold.
Ow.
I will never forget looking into her eyes. They were red, irritated by the dust, but there was this agonizing, suffocating frustration radiating from her. The village elders would point to her and brag to visitors about her piety and her submission. But when they walked away, she looked at the equation in the dirt, then looked at me and whispered, "God doesn't seem to care as much about gravity as I do."
That is a profound distillation of a macroeconomic tragedy right there. If we extrapolate Miriam's reality across millions of young minds, we begin to see the staggering deficit that dogma creates.
The sheer waste of it.
Think about the massive existential challenges facing these regions. Severe water salinity, destroying agriculture, crumbling governance structures, the desperate need for drought-resistant crop yields via biotechnology. These are complex, tangible problems that require the absolute maximum output of human intellect to solve.
You need every smart brain working on it.
But when an entire society is structurally subordinated to a rigid religious framework, the raw processing bandwidth of its youth is systematically diverted.
Their intellectual energy is hijacked. Instead of engineering solutions to starvation, they are forced to spend their mental calories enforcing theological purity, policing each other's behavior, and maintaining systems of submission.
And we must be explicit about the fact that this enforced submission is almost universally directed at controlling women. By restricting the intellectual and economic participation of half the population, the society is willingly amputating its own potential.
It's self-sabotage on a national scale.
It creates a lost generation. They are expending their most valuable, non-renewable resource, human cognitive bandwidth, to preserve archaic power structures at the direct expense of physical human progress.
Okay, let's play this out to its logical extreme. If I am listening to this and I recognize the sheer waste of intellectual capital, my instinct might be to champion the immediate, aggressive dismantling of those religious institutions. We established earlier that authoritarian force leads to violence. But let's assume a society somehow manages to quickly, cleanly dismantle the organized church, perhaps through intense social pressure or rapid legal secularization.
Okay, assuming they pull that off without violence.
Right. If you forcefully uninstall the religious software from a population that is used to relying on it, what actually happens to their belief systems? Do they all magically transform into hyper-rational scientists like Miriam?
This brings us to a crucial, highly counterintuitive finding in sociological research known as the superstition paradox. The assumption that destroying the church automatically produces a society of enlightened rationalists is fundamentally flawed. Yeah, we have access to extensive international data from the ISSP, the International Social Survey Program, which tracks belief systems globally. When researchers analyze this data, they discover a fascinating anomaly. Adherence to superstitious beliefs, such as relying on fortune tellers, consulting astrology and horoscopes, or believing in the power of good luck charms, is actually negatively correlated with traditional religious belief.
I want to make sure I am hearing that correctly. You are saying that in societies where organized religion is incredibly strong, people are actually less likely to believe in superstition or magic.
Correct. And to understand why, we have to look at the historical data from formerly communist nations in Eastern Europe, such as Latvia, Estonia, or Bulgaria.
Where they actively tried to wipe out religion.
During the Soviet era, the state apparatus aggressively and violently suppressed organized religion for decades. They demolished the physical churches, imprisoned or executed the clergy, and banned theological texts. They successfully dismantled the institutional structure of faith.
So they got rid of the church.
However, they failed to recognize a core component of human psychology. In environments of high uncertainty and economic instability, the human brain desperately craves a framework to explain the unpredictable. They destroyed the church, but they did not eliminate the psychological need for supernatural control.
They created a metaphysical vacuum.
Exactly. And because the state-sponsored ideology of communism was failing to provide material security or existential comfort, the population's desire for supernatural explanation simply mutated. Without the organized theological boundaries provided by a formal religion, belief in unorganized magic exploded.
Unorganized magic? Wild.
In the aftermath of the Soviet collapse, ISSP data showed that in countries like Latvia, the percentage of the population consulting fortune tellers or relying on astrological charts to make life decisions skyrocketed to over 70%.
70% of the country is basing their lives on the zodiac because the church was removed. Staggering.
It demonstrates that the demand for the supernatural is highly inelastic in uncertain environments. Furthermore, if we analyze how powerful traditional religions operate in high-belief societies, we see them actively suppressing these very superstitions. Historically, institutions like the Catholic Church in deeply devout nations such as Ireland spent immense resources condemning fortune-telling, astrology, and folk magic.
And they always frame that suppression as a theological imperative. They claim magic is demonic or a violation of God's law. But if we put on our Adam Smith economist hats again, we can see exactly what is actually happening. The Catholic Church isn't just fighting demons, it's fighting for market share.
It is a textbook monopoly defense tactic. The organized church recognizes that fortune tellers and astrologers are offering competing supernatural services. By strictly prohibiting superstition, the church forces the population to rely exclusively on the approved institutional channels for spiritual comfort and existential explanation. They eliminate the competition.
There is a deep, grim irony in all of this. It reveals a profound vulnerability in our psychological architecture. If you use the power of the state to forcibly uninstall the mainstream religious software from a population, but you fail to upgrade their physical hardware, meaning you do not actually improve their material living conditions, you don't build the functional hospitals, and you don't provide the existential security we saw in Denmark, the people do not become enlightened secularists.
Although they do.
They just immediately download superstitious malware. It proves that you cannot simply bulldoze the cathedral and expect human progress to spontaneously generate from the rubble. True, lasting secularization, the kind that produces the peace and prosperity of the Aarhus paradigm, requires the painstaking, unromantic work of building worldly systems that actually function. You have to build the welfare state so effectively that the need for magic naturally atrophies.
When we synthesize the entirety of the data we've explored, from the qualitative fieldwork in Scandinavia to the longitudinal econometric tracking of the secularization hypothesis, to the brutal realities of the club model and political weaponization, a highly objective, undeniable reality emerges. We must fundamentally recalibrate our understanding of how modern civilization developed, the grand moral arc of human history, the codification of universal human rights, the establishment of transparent democracies, the ongoing fight for gender equity. These monumental achievements were not the natural byproduct of a broad, unified religious consensus. In fact, historical analysis dictates that these milestones were frequently won by individuals who actively challenged, subverted, or operated entirely outside the dominant theological frameworks of their eras. The data insists unequivocally that societal progress and moral stability are fundamentally anchored to human security and structural equity, not to the fear of divine retribution.
The great experiment of the 21st century has proven that the ultimate foundation for a moral and thriving society isn't found in enforcing divine laws, but in building secular institutions so reliable, transparent, and effective that citizens simply forget to be afraid.